Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for House of the Dragon Season 1. In this video I will review the entirety of Season 1 of House of the Dragon. So I'll have to start with a spoiler warning for the entirety of Season 1 of House of the Dragon. If you have not seen up to the very end of Season 1, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. So, I have covered House of the Dragon on my channel, but through these live discussion videos only. Now, in the past, I've usually done, like, when I do live discussions, I usually do the recorded reviews as well. The only shows I've ever done weekly live discussions, and in addition, recorded reviews, were Game of Thrones and The Expanse. However, with when House of the Dragon was announced and it was coming up, I was still unsure about this show. In fact, I wasn't really looking forward to it. I was looking forward to Lord of the Rings of Power and more, because Season 7 and 8 had soured me to Game of Thrones so much that I was just no longer interested in this franchise, and I really didn't want more Game of Thrones after I was so sorely disappointed last time we got Game of Thrones. But, I was like, I'll give it a shot, but I didn't want to do like pre-recorded reviews. I was like, we'll do live discussions, and if the show ends up sucking, then we can just make fun of it. But as it turns out, the show was actually really great, which surprised me. I was not expecting the show to be this good. And in fact, I did like it much better than The Rings of Power, which I talked about in my Rings of Power review. So, I should have realized that this is different from Game of Thrones. It has different showrunners. It doesn't have the ones that ruined the last two seasons. And George R. R. Martin was more directly involved, and probably more importantly, it's based off of a book that's already written. So they're actually doing a really good job adapting it. Now, it's not like a fictional novel the way you would think of it, not the way the Song of Ice and Fire novels were. It's not like a novel you sit down and read and has like suspense and gets into the character's viewpoint and stuff like that. It's written like a history book, and it's almost like an appendix to the Song of Ice and Fire books, where it tells you the history of the Targaryen family as written by a historian who's trying to piece together what happened by reading the accounts of other historians and other people who were alive during the time. And this, what the show House of Dragon covers, there's like two main accounts that he's pulling from, but there's also other accounts. So it was like George R. R. Martin wrote it that way to try to make it sort of ambiguous as to what actually happened. And I think that's actually really interesting and great for the show to base the show off of, because you don't have the characterization laid out. They basically lay out the events and some of what the characters say, and you can infer what these characters, what these people were like. But it gives the showrunners a lot of leeway to create their own characters, create their own stories, but as long as they hit the same beats. And yes, the show does change a few things from time to time, but a lot of times when the show does make changes, you could always chalk it up to the historians getting it wrong in the book. And but when George R. R. Martin was asked if the show was the definitive telling of that story, he was like, well, it's a telling. It's just another telling. It's just more, it gives it to you more straightforward, matter-of-factly, which is different from the books which try to tease you with the different accounts which may or may not be true. So it's saying this is what happened, but whether or not you believe this is what actually happened, well, it's all fictional anyway, so none of it happened. So it doesn't matter. It's just a telling. So I was really impressed with this show. It's very different than Game of Thrones, and I think that's a very good thing. I know some people didn't like the show or turned off it because it didn't it wasn't really what they were expecting, and they didn't feel like the characters were as clever or playing the Game of Thrones as they were in Game of Thrones. But for me personally, like when I look at the House of the Dragon, I think it's better than Game of Thrones. But there's a giant asterisk with that statement and that asterisk is, well, that's just because I'm sick of watching Game of Thrones. I've seen it a billion times. All the good seasons, anyway. The bad seasons, of course, I haven't seen as much, and I don't want to, and I won't because I don't want it because they were terrible. And they kind of soured the whole show for me because now it's hard for me to watch the earlier seasons because I know that they're all leaning, because the whole story is crafted on building to something, and what it's building for is something that's written terribly and doesn't make any sense, and completely favors plot over characters, which is completely different from what the first 6 seasons were all about, which favored character over plot, and the characters just did things regardless of whether or not it made sense for their characters. But anyway, I'm not here to rehash how much the last 2 seasons of Game of Thrones sucked, but I will say that looking back on that, it does make me think more favorably of House of the Dragon. And especially if these 3 seasons do hit the landing, which I have really high hopes they will, because the book's already written, and I know what's coming from having read. Well, I've read the shortened version, not shortened version, but the version that's in the World of Ice and Fire, which is a bit not as detailed as the version of Fire and Blood. I am currently reading Fire and Blood, but however, even before I start watching this show, I was already familiar with the events, the main plot points events of what happens in the Dance of the Dragon stories that this show covers. So I already knew like who was going to die and what was going to happen with the war, but I just knew the major beats. I didn't know any of the finer details until I went back and started reading Fire and Blood. But the show, of course, gives even finer details. Which is good. And so knowing what's coming, I am very confident that the show is actually going to hit the landing, and it's going to be a great 4 seasons throughout, which will make it better than Game of Thrones. But it is very different because Game of Thrones was more of a sprawling epic, which followed several different storylines throughout the world. And House of the Dragon is more focused. It's more centralized. It does have a lot of characters who have names that are hard to remember because they all rhyme with one another. Daemon, Vaemon, and Aemon, Rhaenyra, Rhaenys, Rhaena, Viserys, Jaehaerys, Lucerys, and Viserys and Jaehaerys? I don't know. Anyway, yes, so, yes, it does have a lot of characters, but it's more focused on, I wouldn't say one location because we do get several locations in the show, but it's more focused on King's Landing and Dragonstone mainly, and maybe the Driftmark, but mainly its focus is a hell of a lot more focused. As I say, it doesn't bounce back and forth between different storylines and characters over different parts of the world and different parts of Westeros. It mainly follows this main group of characters. And I know that this had thrown some people off and some people didn't like this style of storytelling, but honestly, I think this is what a spinoff of Game of Thrones needed. A spinoff of Game of Thrones needed to be different. It needed to not try to repeat the same thing over again. And a lot of people point out that this spinoff was chosen out of all the other ideas because it is most similar to Game of Thrones. It features people fighting over succession, who gets to be the king, who gets to sit on the Iron Throne, which is all what Game of Thrones was about. And it features like scheming and plotting to try to get people on the throne and stuff like that. So and people maneuvering for power, which is very similar to Game of Thrones. But is more focused on that aspect because Game of Thrones itself was much more than just that. They had different storylines with like Arya becoming a faceless assassin, and Jon Snow up fighting the wildlings and then befriending the wildlings in order to fight the White Walkers, and Daenerys trying to end slavery in the East. Like, so it was a lot more going on than just that. So. And I've also heard some people compare these characters to characters like Littlefinger and Varys, who were like very, very wise at playing the Game of Thrones. But I think, and saying that they weren't as good, that they were more idiotic or whatever, but I think that's unfair because not every character in the Game of Thrones was wise at playing the Game of Thrones. Like Arya didn't even try, and Robb Stark and Ned Stark sucked at it, and Cersei kind of lucked into it, I would say Otto Hightower and Larys are pretty damn good at it, but so I don't see that as a blemish on the show personally. So I think it is different enough, but yet similar enough to be a good spinoff, and that's what makes spinoffs great. See Better Call Saul, for example, for that. And so I was really impressed, and I was really impressed with the pacing of the show, which this season 1 was mainly a setup season, setting the stage for the war to come, which will come in season 2. And so it kind of made a lot of great time jumps. It jumped through time a lot. It starts with our main characters, Rhaenyra and Alicent, as children. And then it follows them through their adolescence, and then halfway through the season, they do an actor change, and they're played by adults now. Now they're adults, and now they have their own children. And so we're introduced to a whole slew of new characters from their children, and then they grow up, and we have time jumps from when they're kids to when they're teenagers. And so it skips and hops through the years rather fast. And I know this may be off-putting for some people, but I think it is, looking at the story as a whole, what the story needed. Now, this is probably going to be unique to season 1, as the later seasons are probably going to more or less stick in the same time frame. We might go a year or two, but we're not going to go like 10 or 20 years in the future and have different actors play the characters anymore. I think we are here with these actors, and we're not going to have any massive time jumps. Maybe like 1 or 2 years, but that's about it. So I think the later seasons will be different in that way, and I think season 1 needed to be this way because we needed this backstory. They couldn't just. I think it was a wise decision to start it back and get the background of these characters, see Rhaenyra's kids, and make Alicent and Rhaenyra childhood friend, which is a change from the books, not the case in the books, and also the show makes it more of a character progression of Rhaenyra and Alicent, and makes them start off being friends and having good intentions and not wanting to go to war, and then eventually, and haven't even fully gotten there by the end of season 1, but Rhaenyra is probably there. And so whereas the books, they were all for like, oh, screw that other person, they're trying to steal my throne, let's go to war immediately. And so I think that's actually way more dynamic for this show to play it that way, and playing the ins and outs. And sometimes it has, as I said, there were like multiple different accounts in history, particularly, for example, like Christian Cole. There were some examples that he was in love with Rhaenyra, but she rejected him. There was some speculation that he had slept with her, or tried to sleep with, or she had tried to sleep with him, and he rejected her. But the show went with, they did sleep together, but then she tried to make him her concubine, and he was not okay with that, and so that's what pushed him to the other side. And so I do like how the show would weave and sort of choose its path, and most of the time, particularly like with that example, I think I love what the show did. I love the path that they chose. It absolutely made sense for the show. And ultimately, I was super impressed with, first of all, the time jump that happened midway through the season. I was worried. And if you watch my live discussion for episode 5, you can see I was worried because I knew that they were changing actors. They were jumping ahead 10 years. They're going to introduce all these kids, children characters. And I was worried that it would feel jarring, and it only felt like a tinge jarring. But for the most part, they made it work. And for the most part, I was very willing and eager to accept these new actors as the same characters. And I think the transition was really smooth. In fact, what was really impressive is how much I cared about these children, these younger children characters, by the end of the season, because they were only introduced halfway through the season, and even the actors that played them in the final episode, the teenage versions of them, had only been in the show for like 2 episodes, and yet I still cared about them. They still got me to care about these children, and part of that is how you cared about them because the parents cared about them, and you were more familiar with the parents, and so it was just written really expertly like that. And another thing I feel the need to point out is bringing back the Rings of Power comparison and that's something I mentioned for my review of the Rings of Power, is that show was, season 1 was mostly set up as well. However, it wasn't set up that was interesting in and on itself. It was set up where you were just waiting for them to get to the point. The Rings of Power had a strong feeling of, come on, get on with it. Like, move things along. Like, all right, can we get to the point? Whereas House of the Dragon did not. Even though it was doing, narratively, structurally, it was doing the same thing. It was setting up for a big conflict to come. But it made its setup interesting in on itself, which is something the Rings of Power, for the most part, barring the whole Elrond and Durin storyline, which I loved, but except for that, especially the new Númenórean stuff, which really was spinning its wheels, and introduced a bunch of characters I did not give a shit about, this setup was interesting in on itself. So I wasn't just waiting to see what would happen next. I wasn't like constantly going, what is this setting up for? I was interested in what it was doing, even though what it was doing was the same thing, setting up for a bigger conflict. But what was happening on screen at that moment was intriguing enough. The characters were interesting enough. The characters and interactions were fleshed out enough. That setup in and on itself was saying something. It was telling an interesting story in and on itself, similar to what Game of Thrones did in its earlier seasons, particularly its first seasons. So I wasn't being impatient, wasn't being like, get on with it. I was enchanted and totally immersed in the setup and what was going on, and I didn't need to wait for them to get to the actual conflict. That being said, I was of course extremely upset when the season ended and I had to wait 2 whole years to see what's happening next, because the show did such a great job of pulling me in and getting me invested in this world and wanting to know, even though I've already read the book, so I know what's going to happen, but I want to see that happen. I want to see what the show does with it. I want to see how these characters are portrayed on this visual medium during the events that I know is coming. And so when the season ended, I was like, no! No! And that is the mark of a really great show, to do that. So overall, was super impressed. Now, the pacing of House of the Dragon wasn't always perfect throughout. Particularly, I would kind of agree that maybe we didn't need as much episodes with the younger characters, and perhaps they should have gotten to the adult versions with their kids a bit earlier on, because since they're the main thrust of everything going forward, particularly episode 3, barring that Stepstones scene at the end, I think probably could have went and was not entirely necessary. But for the most part, I think the pacing of the season was super impressive. Now, really quick, I did want to go through the specific episodes of the show, since I did not do individual reviews for them. So the first episode was Heirs of the Dragon, which I think did a really good job of introducing us to all these characters. As I said, it instantly immersed me in this world, got me invested in it, and the stakes of Rhaenyra being named heir, and how the realm would react to a woman being named Heir and how she reacted to it, and after the tragic death of her mother, and Viserys's motivations for doing that, which is more built out of guilt than any actual faith in Rhaenyra. So very fascinating, great way to start the season. So my rating for Heirs of the Dragon out of 10 is an 8. Extremely good. So then the next episode I actually liked even better, The Rogue Prince, which got more into Daemon pitching a hissy fit and taking Dragonstone for no reason, and Rhaenyra like riding on her dragon. Well, Otto Hightower was sent to stop him. He was about to get himself killed, but Rhaenyra came by and eased the situation, even though they didn't want her to, because they thought it was too dangerous. So they underestimated her because she understood Daemon. She understood exactly how to calm him down and why he was upset. And so really, I think it was a really necessary episode because it really got you into the described in terms what the relationship was like, and of course this episode also was when Otto Hightower kind of shows the master manipulator that he is, that he manipulated Viserys into marrying his daughter so he could stake a claim on the throne, and how that sort of started to drive a wedge between the two friends. So that leads us to the next episode, second of his... Oh, sorry. My rating for The Rogue Prince out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. So then, this leads us to the next episode, second of his name, which, as I mentioned, I believe this was the one that was kind of mostly filler. And I didn't really like the way they portrayed Rhaenyra as a teenager, because they went the route of portraying her as a stereotypical angsty teenage girl who was like, fuck everyone, and had a minstrel blasting music was kind of like the equivalent of a teenager going to the room, locking the door, and blasting heavy metal music. I thought that was silly, and I didn't like the way that she portrayed. I think it was inconsistent with her character, and she should have been more interested in ruling, which would have been more consistent. But I did like how we delved even deeper into the wedge that was being drawn between her and her best friend Alicent. But the whole side plot of the stag, the white stag, and the symbolism behind it was kind of pretentious, and I didn't really care about that. So I wouldn't like this episode that much if not for the ending with Daemon and Corleus fighting the crab feeder in the Stepstones. That was super intense, having Daemon beat the shit out of the messenger who was just telling him his brother was sending help. But he was so mad about, his brother condescending to him that he went on a suicide run that almost got him killed, but he managed to slice the crab feeder in half and bring him out. That was awesome. Seeing the dragon action in that episode as well. So my rating for second of his name out of 10 is a 7. Very good. So the next episode, King of the Narrow Sea, has to do with the marriage alliance. Not yet. King of the Narrow Sea is the Aladdin episode, where Daemon returns to King's Landing and takes Rhaenyra out on these sexual adventures, kind of like a more sexualized version of Aladdin, and he tries to manipulate her, but she takes control, and he doesn't like that and runs off, and then she ends up sleeping with Kristen Cole, which has, very negative implications. But then Alicent is sort of jealous of her because she's forced to marry this old wrinkly man and have sex with him when she doesn't want to, and so she's jealous that, she has this envy, and that turns to anger where she hears that Rhaenyra is just going out sleeping with whoever, and gets really upset, and she has to assure her that, I didn't sleep with Daemon, which she wasn't lying, but I think she said my maidenhood remains intact, which she was lying about. But, from a more modern perspective, I'm thinking, it's none of fucking Alicent's business. But in the world that this is set in the values that they have, it is sort of, Alicent sees it as a betrayal because she is sort of thrust in this world. So yeah, I thought this was a really intriguing, interesting episode as well. So my rating for King of the Narrow Sea out of 10 is an 8. Extremely good. So next we get into We Light the Way, and this was the one that dealt with the marriage where Rhaenyra had agreed to marry Laenor in order to heal the relations between the Valerians and the Targaryens, and she did this to appease her father, who was pissed off with her about the whole rumors things. But her condition, of course, was that Otto Hightower be fired by hand of the king. So it does show that she's smart. And Viserys, did eventually catch on to that Otto was trying to manipulate him. So, God, what's his face? Strong was made. Sorry, I can't remember his name, but he was made hand of the king instead. And then this episode dealt with the marriage. And it starts out great when Viserys proposes marriage between their kids to Corlys, who at first is trying to play it cool and be like, oh, well, and negotiate, they should have my name. But really inside he's like, yes, because he's getting what he wants. And then, but more interesting is the deal that Rhaenyra and Laenor make with each other, because they're friends, they like each other, but they have no sort of romantic interest in each other, and Laenor in fact is gay, something that Rhaenyra knows, and so they may come to agreement like, look, you can sleep with who you want, I'll sleep with who I want, but we'll do our royal duty for our families, which is kind of contemporary. It's kind of new age. It's kind of smart. It makes me like them, but of course is not, would not be okay. It makes them seem smarter than the adults, really, but it would not be okay with, the rules and the culture of this society. But, so, they make this deal and they get married, but then Alicent, discovers from Kristen Cole that Rhaenyra did in fact lie to her, and that she slept with Kristen Cole, who confesses and he wants to die. And then, of course, Rhaenyra tries to make Kristen her paramour, and this is not okay with Kristen Cole, who says, I'm not your whore. He wanted to run off with them, but Rhaenyra's like, why would I run off? I'm going to be the queen. And so this is when he gets really soured to her. In fact, he ends up killing Laenor's lover, because he misunderstood and thought, oh, we're all okay with this agreement, which he wasn't. So he snaps and kills him in the middle of a dinner party, which I had issues with, but I don't really want to get into this there, because why did Kristen Cole get away with this scot-free kind of, I wish that was explained in the show. Like, I know I've heard a lot of people come up with explanations that sound reasonable, but I think the show needed to explain it, not people in YouTube videos. But anyway, it was still really, really guttural ending that was in the shotgun wedding when there was still blood on the floor. It's very Game of Thrones-esque. So my rating for We Light the Way out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. So, next episode after that was The Princess and the Queen. This is when we get the 10-year time jump, and this is when we see sort of the power play already in play, where Alicent demands to see a child that Rhaenyra had just given birth to, and Rhaenyra has to walk across the castle grounds bleeding everywhere because she still had just given birth, but she refuses to just let others take the baby away because she doesn't trust Alicent anymore. So really sort of lays out the political games already in motion, already being played. And we also get a subplot of Daemon, who is now married to Laenor's sister, and they have 2 daughters of their own, and they're living in Pentos, and she doesn't really want to live in Pentos, and she ends up having a miscarriage, and then instead of dying in pain like that, she has her dragon burn her alive. It's kind of a badass way to go, and her taking agency and really having a contrast between how Viserys' wife died in season 1, which was extremely interesting. Yeah, so And then we see the relationship between that their kids, that Alicent's kids and Rhaenyra's kids have, and how at first they're friends, but Alicent is sort of instilling this hatred into her son, saying, they're not your friends, you need to stick up for your own family, because if Rhaenyra becomes queen, she's going to kill you and your brother, so those, boys are not your friends. And then, of course, there's a whole controversy over Rhaenyra's sons being bastards, because they're very obvious to anyone with eyes that it's not Laenor's sons, it is in fact the son of Harlan Strong. And so Kristen Cole sort of goads Harlan into kind of having an outburst, which kind of makes this a controversy and a bit more public. And Larys Strong, who's a very shady guy, makes an alliance with Alicent in order to grab power, and he ends up killing Harlan and his father for her. Pretty fucked up. So yeah, this was a pretty good episode too. So my rating for The Princess and the Queen out of 10 is an 8. Extremely good. So next episode was Driftmark, and this was a really powerful episode that dealt with Laenor's funeral, not Laena's funeral, and where it's very obvious that Corlys's brother, Vaemon, does not like Jacaerys and Lucerys, and is really heavily implying that they're not of Valyrian blood. And Daemon is sort of mourning in his own way, but he ends up sleeping with Rhaenyra. And then we have this Aemon, Alicent's son, claims Laena's dragon, and this is, not okay with the boys, leads to a fight, and it's all fun and games until someone loses an eye, which leaves because Lucan felt like he was, their lives were threatened by Aemon, who was smashing them with a rock, so ends up in self-defense, pulling a dagger and stabbing Aemon's eye out, which sets off Alicent, who wants an eye for an eye and demands that Lucerys lose an eye as well, but of course Rhaenyra's not okay with this. Now there's Viserys, he's like, just let it go, so Alicent grabs the dagger and tries to cut out the eye herself, but Rhaenyra gets right in her way and says, "Oh, I see you always pretending to be the more righteous and noble one, but now everyone sees you for who you really are," which was a beautiful moment. It was so powerful. Absolutely loved it. And then it ends with Rhaenyra realizing that she needs a more powerful ally, more powerful husband, and asks Daemon to be her husband. But he's like, well, in order for me to be your husband, that means your current husband has to die. And so we see them plotting and scheming, and it makes you think that they're killing off Laenor, because we see Laenor's lover go charge at him with the sword. But then we find out that was actually a body swap. Laenor doesn't die. They actually killed some other person and staged it to make everyone think Laenor is dead, but really Laenor gets to go off and live the life that he wants to with his lover across the narrow sea. So it's kind of makes me think even better of Rhaenyra, that she's giving him the life that he always wanted. And she wins out in the deal because she gets the husband that she wants. So I really like this episode. So my rating for Driftmark out of 10 is a 10, the best. So next episode is The Lord of Ties, which is another time jump, and the boys, I believe, are older in this episode, more teenagers. And we see that Corlys has been injured in fighting in the Stepstones, and his brother Vaemon tries to claim the Driftmark under the call that that Rhaenyra's sons are actually bastards and not of Valyrian blood. And this, of course, would not be okay with the king, but unfortunately the king is near his deathbed. He's bedridden and barely competent because he's taking milk of the poppy all the time. So essentially Otto Hightower and Alicent are running the kingdom, and Vaemon knows this and is going to use this to form an alliance with them, in which the Hightowers would love that because they would have the sea power of the Valyrians. But meanwhile, Rhaena has the law on her side, because illegally these are Laenor's sons sons, and there's no reason to deny Lucerys' claim. But when it looks like the Hightowers are going to have their way, Viserys actually pulls himself out of it and forces himself, even though he can barely walk, and we have this touching moment when Daemon helps him to the throne, and he pulls himself up and manages to rule in favor of Rhaenyra, which of course is not at all. It doesn't make Vaemon at all happy, and he outrages and eventually yells that her sons are bastards. And I like how Daemon's kind of goading him to do it. It's like, say, come on, because he knew it would be all the excuse he needed to chop his head off, which is exactly what he does. And then we had this great dinner scene where Viserys has one last dinner with his family, and they try to get along. But as soon as Viserys leaves, the children start acting up and fighting each other. Sort of saying that, no, sorry, as much as you might want these families to get along, they're not going to. So that was also a great episode. So my rating for The Lord of the Ties out of 10 is a 10. The best. So next, we go to the Green Council, which was a really interesting episode. Maybe I was expecting this episode to be better than it was, because it's when Viserys dies, and it's when Alicent and Otto Hightower seize control of the throne and crown Aegon as king, regardless of Viserys' wishes. Now, Alicent, through a misunderstanding on what Viserys was saying on his deathbed, has convinced herself that he said that he wanted Aegon to be king, but of course we know for a fact this is not the case. And I think that, and at first I was unhappy with this because it seems like a sitcom trope of the comical misunderstanding, but when I look at it more in the perspective of Alicent just deluding herself and hearing what she wants to hear, it does kind of make sense, because she does feel, and this is something the show is portraying consistently, she feels like she's in the right. She feels like she's the righteous one. She feels like she's the true and loyal and pious one, when really she's not. It's just delusional. And so that's why she's not happy when she hears that her father, along with a bunch of the people in the small council, had already been scheming to crown Aegon, because that's not righteous, that's not pious, and she wants to appear pious. And so we get this whole fight about it because Aegon can't be found, so we get this struggle of who's going to find him first. So Alicent sends some people, and Otto sends some people, which I kind of felt was like fake stakes, because they both want to crown Aegon. And true that they want to sort of impress upon him different reasons, because Alicent doesn't want to kill Rhaenyra where Otto does, so they want to get to him first to try to convince him of that. But it's not really, they're both on the same side, so having this like play of who's going to get to Aegon first, I thought was kind of fake stakes. But we do get a lot of interesting character moments through those interactions. We learn more about Aegon and Aemon and these two Kingsguard twin brothers who end up siding on different sides, which I thought was really interesting as well. And then of course we get the final crowning of Aegon at the end, where Rhaenys, who's being held captive, escapes and manages to break out with her dragon and screams at them. Now, this is something else I'm mixed on, because I don't like how the show set up a situation where she could have ended the whole war right then and there. I agree with some of the reasonings they gave on why she didn't kill the Hightowers, but it's kind of messy to me, because this didn't happen in the books, and it seems unnecessary to put the situation in where she could have stopped what would lead to millions upon millions of people dying, and she could have ended it right here. So I kind of wish they didn't do that, but it was still an awesome scene. So my rating for the Green Council out of 10 is an 8. Extremely good. So then we get into the big finale, the Black Queen, where the previous episode followed Alicent and the Hightowers on their side, the green side. This follows the black side's Rhaenyra side on Dragonstone, her reaction to hearing that her throne was stolen from her, and how this causes her to give a miscarriage and the tragedy around that, and how Daemon is trying to use this to jump to war immediately, and Rhaenyra is trying to temper him and temper everyone else who immediately wants to go to war. She's like, but she wants to consider all of her options and consider the costs on this. And Rhaenys sees this, and she appreciates that and sees that Rhaenyra is actually going to be a good leader, and so convinces Corlys to side with her. because of this, and that was really powerful, and how this you get this divide between her and Daemon, because Daemon feels like she's being foolish, but actually considering bowing to Aegon, as Otto Hightower suggests, but she doesn't want to throw the realm into chaos. She doesn't want to just cause all this death and bleeding, which is eventually what happens, but she hasn't decided she's not going to. She wants to weigh all of her options, so she sends out her sons to make alliances, but misjudges the Baratheons, thinking that it would be an easy alliance, so sends her younger son, Lucerys, not her youngest, that's Joffrey, he's way too young to go anywhere, but her younger son, Lucerys, to make this easy alliance, but it turns out that she misjudged the Baratheon boy, that she didn't know as well as she thought, and he is not an easy alliance. In fact, he sides with the Greens, and in fact, Aemon was already there with his bigger, much scarier dragon, and he causes a stir and chases Luke down and kills him, which is unintentional on Aemon's part. He just wanted to scare him, but his dragon does what his dragon wants to do, and his dragon did not take kindly to the other dragon, lighting him on fire, so killed him. And so now we see Rhaenyra's face at the end of the episode, pissed off as all hell, and we know war is going to break out. And this is the moment where I was like, I wanted to see more. I wish they had included her speech to Otto, her response to Otto Hightower, saying, I'm going to kill you all. I thought that would have been a more epic way to end the season. It would have felt like a season finale. I think the way they ended it felt like just a normal episode ending. But that's an extremely minor complaint. It's not that big a deal. I still loved this episode, so my rating for The Black Queen out of 10 is a 10, the best. So my rating for season 1 of House of the Dragon as a whole is a 9, excellent. It's a strong 9, a very strong 9. In fact, I'm very close to giving the show a 10, but I kind of held myself back a bit because I know the show's going to get even better. Even though I was really impressed how they were managed to do all these time jumps and keep me interested in these characters, even through actor changes, even through introducing all these new characters who themselves had actor changes. Very impressive. However, yeah, I do see the first half of the season did have some pacing issues, particularly with episode 3. So it's not a perfect season, but way better than I thought it would be. So a very strong 9. So that is it for my review of House of the Dragon Season 1. Thank you so much for watching this video, and be sure to check out my channel as I do more House of the Dragon live discussions. I got one more that's a book spoiler discussion coming up, I believe the day this video goes live on my channel. And also I'll cover many more shows like Star Trek shows like Star Trek Lower Decks, Star Trek Prodigy, and covering every episode of the original series, Star Trek the original series, but also covering many more shows on my channel, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.